Hey guys, I'm Darren Miles with Darren Miles Photography, and I'm based here in beautiful, sunny Southwest Florida. And like a lot of photographers, I too have recently jumped on the Fujifilm medium format, really large format, bandwagon, and I bought a GFX 50S. However, I shoot a lot of portraits and real estate, and with the Fuji line of GF lenses, I have more than my fair share of options for a portrait lens. Where the system falls a little bit short, at least with native glass, is in the area of ultra-wides. They have the 23mm, which is about 18mm equivalent in 35mm terms, which is nice, but often it's not wide enough for a lot of the work that I do. I needed something wider. Fortunately, there is a third-party option available today for real estate and architectural photographers who utilize the GFX system, and that is this. This is the Venus Optics Laowa 17mm f4 ultra-wide-angle lens, offering a 13mm full-frame equivalent field of view, which is a massive field of view that'll have you covered if you shoot landscape or architecture. But can it come anywhere close to the standard that Fuji has set in the GF line? Well, let's find out. First up is the build quality, and Laowa has a reputation for well-built lenses, and the 17 is clearly no exception. It's made out of metal and it's heavy, tipping the scale at just under 2 pounds or 829 grams, and when combined with the cinder block of a camera that it is, the GFX 50S, the combination can wear you down pretty quickly if you aren't taking advantage of a tripod. Fortunately, most landscape and architectural photographers are in fact utilizing a tripod when they're utilizing this camera and lens. That's a good thing because the combined weight of both the camera, this lens, and I use the grip, it all exceeds 4 pounds, which doesn't seem like all that much, but try carrying a 4-pound weight around all day long. Rest assured you're going to notice it. Now, unlike most other ultra-wide-angle lenses, the 17 is long and rather narrow, and it looks a bit more like a telephoto than a wide angle. The focus ring is smooth and creamy and moves with a perfect amount of resistance. It has a brilliant quality feel to it. The aperture ring clicks gently from setting to setting, and it too has a nice quality feel. It's barely audible. The mount is made out of metal, but as you can see, there are no electronic contacts. This is a completely manual lens. It's an analog experience. Now check out that bulbous front element. It's bulbous and it protrudes, but it doesn't really compare size-wise to the bulk of other wide-angle lenses out there in the marketplace. That's probably because the Laowa is an f4, but if it were an f2.8, I sense the front element would be a lot larger. There's no lens hood included, but the front of the lens does have a filter thread that allows us to utilize 86mm filters. On the inside, it's a complicated formula of 21 elements arranged in 14 groups, and included in that formula are 2 spherical elements and 3 extra low dispersion elements. There's also something applied to the front element called frog eye coating. This helps repel water and dust. Unfortunately, there's no other indication of weather sealing, and I can't find any rubber gaskets at the mount to indicate there's much beyond the said frog eye coating. The aperture ranges from f4 to f32. Speaking of the aperture, there are only 5 aperture blades, which makes for a surprisingly smooth out-of-focus bokeh rendering. Now, I've mentioned this before, but we don't usually buy an ultra-wide-angle lens for its bokeh abilities, but we'll cover that more in the optics section. On the downside is this front lens cap. I really don't know a nice way to put this, but this thing is garbage. On numerous occasions, the cap would just fall off because it doesn't take much pressure at all for the cap to pop off, exposing that bulbous front element. Maybe I have a bad copy, but this is a lens that is destined to get damaged. But apart from that nit and the seeming lack of additional weather sealing, the 17 is otherwise solid. So for build, the 17 gets a 9 out of 10. Next up is a word about manual focus and the Laowa. As mentioned already, the 17 is a completely analog lens. I can't even seem to get the focus peaking to work with it either. Fortunately for me, the bulk of the time, what I'm doing with this lens is I'm shooting real estate and architecture, and I'm also shooting at f8. What that means is at 13mm equivalent and f8, we have a massive depth of field. That is the portion of the scene that's going to be in focus. And at this focal length, if your goal is to get everything in focus, then setting the focus at or near infinity will result in getting the whole scene in sharp focus. Now, if you want to get some separation, you can set the lens to f4 and get to the minimum focus distance, which is just under 8 inches. That will result in some nice out-of-focus bokeh rendering. The effect is compounded by the large sensor inside the GFX. It's nice, but again, it's likely you're not buying this lens to be dazzled by its bokeh abilities. The bottom line though, for AF speed and accuracy and the Laowa, it simply doesn't apply. Next up is where the rubber meets the road, and that is, how are the optics? For its intended purpose of architecture, I'm happy to report that the results are pretty nice, especially stop down. In real estate and architecture, it's common to stop down to f8 or even as far as f11, because again, the goal is to get everything in the scene in focus. But even stop down, the edges tend to suffer just a little bit. Fortunately, most clients aren't examining the frame's edges. They're usually more focused on the frame center. We're going to do something a little bit different in this review. What we're going to do is we're going to go into Lightroom and we're going to examine the image quality of some of the images. We're going to check out the edges, the chromatic aberrations, sun stars, etc. So let's go into Lightroom. All right, guys, so we are here in Lightroom. What I wanted to do is I wanted to give you some good examples about the Laowa's performance in the real world. And we've got 4 examples here that we're going to run through, and we're going to cover a couple of important things, but most importantly, center performance, edge performance, sun stars, and chromatic aberrations, and overall just appearance and look and feel to the lens and the results that we're getting out of it. What I've done here is I've taken 4 raw files from over the course of the past month that I've had the lens, and I brought them into Lightroom. We're going to zoom in and zoom out and take a look at some of these. This first image, this is a very typical image of what I would do in real estate for a front or exterior elevation. It's a single exposure. It's shot at 1/40th of a second. Now that's important. Keep in mind that on the edges, what you may see here in these palm fronds, it may actually be motion blur as opposed to bad optical quality. I've got another shot a little bit later that's shot at 1/500th of a second, and that should freeze the action pretty well, especially if anything's slow moving, so that will give us a much better representation. But this is just an overall type picture, and keep in mind when you are shooting at f8, you'll note that in here, for whatever reason on this lens, the Laowa, it determines that it's f1. It was actually shot at f8. I don't know why it does that, but anyway, so keep in mind, these are all shot at f8, and for whatever reason, it's reading it at f1. Okay, so this is the overall picture. Overall, to me, this looks pretty reasonably sharp. It looks pretty good. Let's zoom into the center and see what that looks like. These are big files, by the way. These raw files are 116 megabytes each. So sometimes it takes a second or two to click in. Okay, so as you can see, this is pretty sharp. I mean, I could make out that 201 pretty well. We're zoomed in at 200%. Let's go to 300% and just see. Looks pretty good. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's not bad at all. Let's kind of move around here a little bit. Foreground looks pretty sharp. And then if we scroll over to the corner, you can see up here where we're going. As you get more and more to the corner, you can see we start to get some degradation in image quality. And by the time we get to the extreme edge here, I doubt we're going to see much in the way of motion blur here, but you can see that edge performance on the corners here definitely suffers a little bit. Let's go to the other corner just for the heck of it. And you can see kind of a similar result. This is not surprising. Even on Nikons or even smaller sensored cameras, when you go to the corners, typically the resolution is just not going to be as strong. It just physically can't be as sharp as it is in the center. As you can see, as we get further and further away from the center, or from the edge and into the center, the results look a lot sharper and a lot cleaner. Let's go to this next image here. This too is also shot at f8, but this is at 1/500th of a second, so this should eliminate any motion blur that we may get, because at 1/500th of a second, even a slow moving object should be pretty well frozen. So let's zoom into the edge here, and you can see we're getting a little bit of degradation in image quality, but it's not too bad. And fortunately, as I mentioned earlier in the review, most of my clients anyway are definitely looking more at the center of the frame, and when you look at this frame center, it's pretty sharp. No one is going to a brochure and zooming into the corners and examining image quality. That's a rare person that would do that. I wouldn't be too concerned. But here again, f8, just showing you a faster shutter speed. The edges still suffer a little bit. They're not terrible by any stretch, and pretty good for a wide-angle lens, but This is typical for wide-angle lens performance, and just keep in mind the image sensor on the GFX is huge, so the surface area or the actual portion of the image that the lens has to cover is much greater, so this is still a fairly impressive performance. Let's go to a nighttime shot here. This is only at like an 1/8 or 0.8 seconds. That's a pretty slow shutter speed. I would expect to see some motion blur here. And sure enough, we're definitely going to be getting some of that here. And that's just downright fuzzy, but this is more to do with motion than it is necessarily bad optics. Because as you can see in the center of the frame, it's a little bit fuzzy, probably from the longer exposure. But generally speaking, it's pretty sharp. Every one of these is shot at ISO 100. And you know, generally speaking, it's pretty good. I'm not seeing a ton of distortion either, which is nice to see. And then last two things I want to show you is the sun stars and the chromatic aberrations. First, let's take a look at the sun stars. This is only a 5 aperture blade aperture diaphragm, so we've got 10 pointed sun stars here, but these are kind of interesting because they have like double spikes on some of these and only single spikes on others. Still, is it the kind of stuff anybody's really going to notice? No, and nobody's going to zoom into a sun star and see, but I think they're pretty cool sun stars just the same. That's what you'll get with the Laowa. And then this looks like a good point of contrast in case anybody is unsure what a chromatic aberration is. What ends up happening is you have these transitions between light to dark, and a lot of lenses have a hard time handling that. And what happens is in that transition, there's a color shift of like purple or green or magenta. But let's zoom in like really close here and see if we can see anything in the way of noticeable chromatic aberration. Let me let that load. I mean, I'm zoomed in here to 300%, and I think it has to load here for a second because I can hear my computer in the background making some noise, like the hard drive's still spinning. And I'm looking really closely here. I'm not seeing much in the way of anything that's relevant as far as chromatic aberrations are concerned. So overall, that's a pretty decent performance. Bottom line is, like a lot of wide-angle lenses, the Laowa does a great job in the center of the frame, and frankly, that's a good thing. Again, nobody's really examining these edges too much. If they are, they might need to get their heads examined because really, who is looking at the edge of a frame like that? Hardly anybody. They're just looking at the center of the frame. And the fact that this lens can excel at the center of the frame is a great thing, which makes it very usable for real estate photography and architectural photography if you happen to be a GFX user. What I'm going to do now is we're going to run through about a minute's worth of sample images. These are finished images. Most of my images are composites, but this is how I would utilize the lens. So coming up now is some finished images from the Laowa, and enjoy. And after that, we'll wrap it up with the value section and the conclusion. Last up is value. And for what it is, at just under $1,200, then I think the Laowa is actually a pretty good value. Coupled with the fact that there isn't a native lens from Fuji that covers this focal length, then there really isn't a whole lot of choice, is there? Just the same, I'm pleased to say that stop down, the Laowa does a really great job in real estate and architecture, which again is the lens's intended purpose, and it does it with aplomb. On the downside is the fact that the lens is only partially weather sealed, and this front lens cap is just a thorn in my side. It really is. And as mentioned, it's a completely manual lens, but apart from those things, it's built well, and the optics are, in my opinion, good enough. So for value, the Laowa gets a 9 out of 10. To wrap up this review, we gave the Venus Optics Laowa GF 17mm f4 lens a 35.5 out of 40 and our recommended rating. keeping in mind that this is a completely manual lens. We didn't rate it on autofocus speed and accuracy. The final word, if you're a Fuji GFX shooter and you're on the market for an ultra-wide-angle lens, then the Venus Optics Laowa 17 is a compelling option. Optics that are good enough for most real estate, architecture, and landscape photographers, solid build quality, and all at what I believe to be a fair price. That is, until Fuji introduces an ultra-wide that comes close to covering something in this same focal range. I'm Darren Miles with Darren Miles Photography, and I'm based here in beautiful, sunny Southwest Florida. If you like videos like this, go ahead and give me a like, or better yet, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and until the next time, happy shooting.